when you um, one of the things I have to do first um, is to let you know that we are recording our meeting, and we're going to try to keep it clean as much as possible. Well, my session is titled Game On, and faculty just want to have fun. I presented this before to our faculty earlier in the spring semester, but it was pretty rough. And so I retitled it simply Game On and took the fun out of it. And I'll explain that in a bit. So most of you are here because you probably have read the description and it sort of intrigued you or captured your attention. And we know we have been going through a great deal in the past year in the transitions that we've been making. And one of the things that I've been trying to figure out is if I was the only one going through a period of stress, anxiety, confusion, disillusionment, especially during the COVID phase. I was hired and I began teaching at Horry-Georgetown Tech in last year. So fall was my first year of the transition. And when I came in, we had a great deal of newness in our college that I had to get accustomed to. So when I began doing some research, we technically are considered, or teachers are considered to be sort of this superheroes, invulnerable to any kind of external pressures or forces. But the reality of it is that there was probably more victims than survivors of COVID when COVID quickly came to us and sort of knocked us off our feet. And eventually, many of us reached what is called gadget exhaustion. One of the things that we attempted to do in transition to teaching was to go online or virtual. And from doing that, we didn't have a lack of resources. We have an overwhelming amount of resources with available tools like Nearpod, Kahoot, Perez, a number of things that we can learn online. For the newcomer, it was quite overwhelming. I was listening to our speaker, Kim Radcliffe, just recently, and she also referenced the same article conducted by the Chronicle of Higher Education on how faculty are on the verge of burnout. Faculty, like myself, are experiencing a great deal of, oh, my screen's too big. Let me adjust. Not sure why that moved. Here we go. We lack interaction. Summarize it, we are by nature or nurture interactive beings. We are relational to others, and many of us who missed this relationship we had a profound impact on not only our lives, but also how we do our work. And so that brought me to the idea that I wanted to know what faculty were experiencing because I was struggling with how to transition to online teaching and engaging my students who are also reaching this kind of fatigue. And from the research that we know so far, a great deal of professors, I think our speaker recently for this summit stated that 74% of women and 53% of males experience a deterioration of their life. In other words, it has been a rough year. And for some, it has been more rougher than others. And what I have done is been able to adapt with the changes and trying to change not only myself, but also the way I teach and the way I reach students. Despotency is perhaps one of the biggest calamities I can say, or things that we have experienced in that there's a great deal of lowering of our spirits and a loss of hope and loss of courage for teaching, so much so that even senior tenure faculty have pushed up their retirement. And so in order to, I think, to protect myself as a defensive mechanism, in my experience, I decided to change myself and approach teaching in a new way. And so I found gamification. For today, what I want to do is take you through or walk you through several things. First, I'm not going to assume that everybody knows what gamification is. I myself, I'm very new to the culture of gamification or how exactly it works in higher education. Gamification is adapted by businesses and corporations in the real world at a much faster rate than higher education. And so there are few resources that we can grasp at. And what I have found in terms of how they apply to higher education has been very useful. Second, why do games matter in the first place? Sometimes I take myself too seriously, and I forget that we just have to play and enjoy ourselves and have fun sometimes while we're trying to be professionals in higher education. And games matter today more than ever, given the fast rate of popularity. The gaming industry has increased amongst young adolescents, especially our college students, who are constantly playing with apps or games online. So there must be something that is useful or that I can find to leverage gaming in order to reach my students in a culture that they are accustomed to. Third, how do I gamify? I have no idea where to start, what resources to use, who to contact. I'm not a game developer myself, and so I wanted to find an easy, approachable way that I can use in my classrooms without having to retrain myself as a computer genius or a programmer. And finally, is it rewarding? And it's not very rewarding when you catch yourself making spelling mistakes on a PowerPoint. As you can see here, that it basically means, do I get a sense of fulfillment? Am I gratified with the quality and the type of teaching that I'm offering my students? And I always think that I have something better to do or by tweaking my teaching or by reinventing my teaching so that I can have a better quality of teaching for my students and their experiences. So I thought I would touch on those four questions in this presentation. First, I'll take a breath here and just let you read the definition. This is a working definition of gamification. Okay, so there are a couple of things that you may have noticed in this definition that are highlighted. First of all, gaming is usually seen as something that we do outside of education. Gaming hasn't traditionally been seen as part of best practices in education, and many times it's sort of a new novel idea by a few of our colleagues or friends who use games in their classroom to entertain our students. But the very few of us have really developed an entire 16-week course based on gamification. And today, that's not the purpose of this session. Okay? The purpose of this session is, how have I used or leveraged gamification to gain the desirable behaviors that I want from my students so that they can become more productive and better learners? And so how does game contribute to me being a better teacher and helping my students in their behavior to be successful in college? And that's what I'm working with today. The source of this definition comes from The Reality is Broken and Jane McGonigal. She does an amazing analysis of society and how our world, our entire social world is now becoming digitalized and gamified. And education is fastly reaching the conclusion that it also has to move forward in the gaming industry in order to, well, engage our students. Engaging our students is part of trying to make them better learners. So in my journey, I actually am reading a textbook or a book called Gamification of Learning, an Instructional Field Book. I'm not pitching this book. I'm not asking you to buy this book. So, generally, it's a book that I found to be useful on how to develop a course. But at the same time, there's an excellent chapter on why gaming matters in the classroom. The first thing that comes out and jumps at us is that, students are pretty hesitant to take on projects that are at high risk. For example, high-risk testing has sort of this negative connotation, and it creates sort of phobia or fear in them. What gaming allows them to do is it allows them to move progressively with steps by steps in adapting to learn from simple concepts to more complicated thinking. And so it's a very low-risk kind of process that our students will go through. The second thing is the word engagement. I don't know how many times we use the word engagement, and that word in itself it's very slippery because it has a wide range of definitions. For each of us, we may perhaps define engaging in a very unique way that we sort of shape our pedagogy with. And so I like to use the word engrossing, because engrossing goes beyond simply engaging students. It actually puts them in a deep engagement where they are interacting purposely to accomplish a goal. We can engage students in activities and in lectures, but gaming brings in a very unique approach in that it actually has a goal for students to reach, and each goal that they reach, they are rewarded with some kind of recognition. They are recognized for their success. And so in this sense, it addicts them to continue to work to gain that goal. Second, immediate reflective feedback. You as an instructor could relax and enjoy yourself as the game itself offers students multiple opportunities to succeed, to learn from their mistakes, to move forward and reflect on how to try things differently in order to reach their goal. So it's a self-reflection process that students are engaged in deeply that is very different than an engaging activity. This reflects, they have to reflect how they are moving step by step, and they have to make decisions and reflect on the consequences of those decisions. And so in a sense, gaming, unlike activities, teleports students into the activity mentally as if they were part of the bigger world. In other words, it's real world learning because we can put our students in real world situations with gaming. Finally, positive change. Student behaviors, students come to college and they are, many are just out of high school and they are learning to become college students. There are many rules that we put in our syllabi that we want students to learn and actually commit to and follow through. Many times when we have our syllabus and our rules in our syllabus, they may forget or they may not remember, or it's just not a habit to practice the things that we are demanding from them. And I found that with certain games, we can teach our students positive, engaging behaviors. So soft skills or hard skills, these are the skills that can be more easily taught in a gaming situation. And so those are all of benefits. The main point to keep in mind from all these benefits is that gaming is as interactive as relevancy is relational. Gaming, in other words, is not just interactive, but it's actually a relational process because the game is relevant to the immediate life of our students. Okay, let me say that again. The content that we teach is immediately relevant to the personal life of what the student is going through. And by doing that, the content and knowledge that we teach becomes part of their self-experience. And in the long run, they are able to remember those stories and those experiences a lot better than simply trying to memorize or trying to learn procedures. And so many of us retain stories from our past, retain stories from our families, tell stories in the classroom because we know we are more likely to remember a story that somebody tells us than actual textbook material that we are reading. And so for those purposes, I believe that gaming, for me so far, is beginning to feel that way. So let me start out first on this next slide. I can't help it. I'm a sociologist by training, and after teaching more than, excuse me, more than 15 years, I kind of see the world from my discipline. I think many of us who have been in our discipline for quite a while have our different worldviews. And the way we see the world is through our training. And much of that has to do with our experiences and how we practice our discipline. I rely heavily, and I found that much of what George Herbert Mead's theory informs us of, what he contributes to us, is part of gamification.
When did she say that?
So what I want to do
Thanks.
is I want to start with 3 processes that we go through in order to become fully engaging relational human beings. For me, there were 3 processes. The first one is imitation. And imitation is one way by which children learn to mimic other people's behavior without processing or thinking about rules, what those behaviors means, what those symbols means. It's just simply repeating or mimicking. Very simply, the process of mimicking works like this. The baby is watching TV while the dad reads the newspaper. He sees something on television and he starts to act that way. He has no idea why he's behaving that way. He does the same moves as the dancer on TV and eventually realizes that he can do the same behavior in another environment, although the child is not aware that the rules of that environment are demanding different expectations. So if I think about it in terms of my students, students have habits and behaviors that may not be productive to their success in college. So they will come into our classrooms, into our colleges, assuming the same behaviors will help. For example, high school study habits may be different in college. Teachers' expectations in K through 12 may be very different than instructors in college or professors. So having said that, what I want to do is show you an illustration of mimicking. This is my nephew, and my nephew is playing Pokemon.
Oh, go get the Pokemon.
And I don't know how to play Pokemon. I didn't jump on the culture of Pokemon, but Pokemon is indeed very popular. What you will see here is he is actually learning how to not only play the game, but also there's a purpose of the game, which involves saving others.
Oh, go get the Pokemon. Get the Pokemon. Do. Get the Pokemon. Get the Pokemon. Throw the Pokemon. You got it.
Grab the ball, grab the ball.
Oh. Throw it.
Harder to see how to judge the spacing like this.
And so there you have Alexander. Everybody calls him Nunu because, well, Alexander's a long name. So Nunu is trying to somehow grab the Pokemon, and later, without even me knowing, he is trying to save me from Pokemon that are around me. And so somewhere along the line, he learned that from the game without me having to teach it, without the parents having to teach it. He sort of picked it up on compassion and what to do. Here, for example, he's trying to capture Pokemon that are around my head.
Oh, it ran over.
Oh, I have grass on me.
That's on place. Hey.
Oh, I got a bird in my head. Get the bird on my head.
So we're just having fun. You know, it's my nephew. I'm visiting my parents who are sick in Texas, and somehow we have to entertain them. And in the same way, we have had a very, very rough year. And for some reason, this cartoon is very popular in our syllabi. Has anyone ever seen this cartoon? No? Okay, I found it in a few syllabi, and I also found it online. It's from PhD Comics, and here is a student who comes to ask the instructor for several things. What do we notice about this cartoon is that we instructors are, well, very preoccupied and fairly busy, you know, either grading papers or working on our courses. And it's a very individual, lonely time that we spend in our offices working a long, long hours. But students sometimes decide to come to us for questions or for answers that we think they should already know. Perhaps the reality of a real job is that there are sometimes some real tough days, and sometimes our students, we can be pretty unhappy with our students, especially in this tough year of COVID, where we are finding that our morality, our spirit for reaching our students compassionately is declining amongst faculty in the United States. And so what I want to do today is begin to work with you. And this is the fun part of the presentation. We are going to go to Nearpod. And so I'm hoping that some of you are near your computer and you can use your computer. Nearpod is a learning tool that I have been using and adapted just this year at Tech. When I go to Nearpod, I'm going to activate a lesson that should appear on your phone. So if you don't have Nearpod, you can go to the Nearpod webpage and either join us or on your Nearpod and add the code that's going to come up on the screen. So does anybody out there let me know when you're on, or I should be able to see it.
Can we play this on the laptop, or does it have to be our phone?
believe it can be on the laptop.
But the phone may be better.
Well, no, for this particular activity, something with keys.
It's better.
Computer-
Okay.
Yeah, your computer is much better for this
Okay.
particular activity.
Okay. Thank you.
When you access Nearpod, this is the code that it's going to give you, WSLH9. The first game on Nearpod that we're going to play is called Adorable. And Adorable is a game that I use during the first week of instruction. And so I thought it might be handy for many of you just to share this game. It's a very simple game, but I'm going to give everyone about, let me see here, maybe 5 minutes or less to finish it. 4 minutes, 4 minutes. So Adorable asks us to do certain things. You are the little person. That little person you can move with your keyboard. You're using your 4 arrows, the up, sideways, down, left and right arrows on your keyboard. And what you do once you start tapping on your keyboards is that you can move the little man. Now, the objective here is to pick up this yellow key and to run as fast as you can to enter this door. It is timed, so you might have to try several times. At the end of the game, once you accomplish the course, you are going to be given a message. And that message we can talk about after we finish the game. So why don't you go ahead and individually go to It's Adorable. You can also type It's Adorable on Google, or you just click on It's Adorable on the Nearpod app. Once you enter the door, you're in the game. And you can go ahead and start. Yeah, I will personally exit so you can all play. Comment section. Where's the comment section?
I'm moving my little guy through the door, but nothing is happening.
Are you in the game?
You got to get the key.
You got to get the key.
Oh, get the key. Thank you. Sorry.
Get the key. Go to the door.
Okay.
All right. Where is, in the meantime, Can someone, are we still in Nearpod? Hope that didn't lose anyone.
We're still in it. We're in the, we have, our screen looks like your screen.
Okay, fantastic. For some reason, someone was not able to get the code. So I'll type, the code is at the top corner of the window, as you can see. 9. Okay, at Gene. Okay, so fantastic. So Nearpod allows us to actually have a conversation with our students on a platform. This is the activity here, and as you can see, the door analogy. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and they keep coming in. This is wonderful. As you go through this process, you can read some of them on your own also, see if you had a similar experience to others. Yeah, so why is Eduardo doing this? What's the purpose of Adorable? It's a cute game for sure, and gives us a little heart at the end, lets us know that we've accomplished our task. So that we are loved really gives us a sort of warm feeling that we have accomplished something good. But it took a couple of tries. I think it took me at least 6 times or 7 times because I don't know, it says here, like Lisa says, I probably need some meditation myself because that eye-hand coordination, I did not have it with me. At the same time, the game was a little stressful for some students, just like our content is that we are teaching. Sometimes our students have different emotional reactions to the information that we are providing. In what ways can we use this activity to teach students about the expected positive behaviors we want from them as they pertain to the syllabus? We can open this for a conversation for a few minutes. I'll start out first. Well, sometimes I have to do things many times to get it right. I shouldn't be, sometimes I expect 100, for example, on my assignments, but I realize that I have to try to improve myself and think about approaching the same problem from a different direction. It didn't make sense for me to try to go around the course in the same way. I had to change what I was doing in order to succeed. And so that's what college requires me to do, is to change my habits.
Yeah, for me, it shows that you have to have persistence and that things aren't going to come to you just the first time around. I mean, especially I have students that they read a poem once and think that they just need to read that poem once. No, you may need to read that 14-line sonnet 10 times in order to truly understand everything, in order to prepare for class. That skimming it right before class isn't preparing for class. And so, effort is involved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, persistence in trying not just one time and giving up, right? You have to try several times to do something. Particularly if you're working with D2L and you can't find where the Dropbox is, you might have to go through different windows or different tabs to find out where that is. So it is showing that kind of persistence that individually you have to be resourceful, right? It's a very good point, Chuck. Thank you for sharing. Okay, there's a lot of lessons that we can think of. One is being on time. If you're not on time to class, the door may be shut. If you don't pay your financial aid on time, you're going to be purged from class, for example. So you have to take the steps in order for you to pay your tuition, or else I'm going to drop you out of the class to a certain time. And that's a very important point to tell our students, because so many times they end up being purged and they don't know why they were purged. And it's fine now is part of our enrollment and our financial aid situation. So we can teach about college policy. We can teach about what they learned about themselves in terms of being persistent. Also, in the end, it tells the students that if we do something right, if we follow the right steps and right procedures, it shows them that we care about them, that we care about their success. We're not just going to let them fail one time. They're going to fail multiple times, but they can rely on us who are in college and we live behind the closed door. That's where we live. But if they find us, they will find someone who's willing to help them through the game of college. And so each of you can take your own personal message that you want to relate to students the first day of class, and it's a very cute activity to do. All right, let us return to the PowerPoint. The second stage of development, I think our students learn rules from the syllabi, and they have to practice over and over again. Many of us, however, know that our students are training to become someone. They want to be teachers. They want to be lawyers. They want to be work on engines, on boats. They want to go into nursing, forestry, fishing. And all those require them envisioning the kind of person they're going to become. So Mead believes that play is very important. And as instructors, we've done role play many, many times to try to teach our students how to take on or how to put on the shoes of other people. In other words, we're trying to show empathy. George Herbert Mead said that play matters because not only children, but our students are also trying to learn the role of a specific other. And that's what playing does for children. They can play at being a mom, they can play at being a doctor, a nurse. It symbolizes a role and the behaviors are expected in that role. Students is a role, and they also have certain student expectations that requires them to become whatever they want to become. A sociologist, a psychiatrist, a fire person, work for the local social work department. So they have to practice being that. So ultimately, what we're trying to teach is empathy. So this introspection of being familiar with the kind of person they're going to become. And so we put our students in a great deal of playing roles. So we're going to navigate back to Nearpod, and we're going to play the game called Spent. I use this game in order to teach empathy, but also introspection about poverty. In Spent, you are given a role or a position. And the goal is to teach our students that much of the decisions that we make depend on external forces, or that is external situations that we may encounter. So during play, student is learning that they have to make decisions and they have to consider the situation which they're in. So I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes to click on Spent and go through the process of making decisions, not just for yourself, but also learning to consider others, specific others. So let's play this for 5 minutes and then we can come back for an open conversation. You can go ahead and click on Spent. I'll give us 5 minutes and we can go through the process and come back for a conversation on how do we feel making certain decisions based on our situation. Okay, welcome back. Our 5 minutes are up. Normally, because, well, due to time, I think we can just open up the conversation and talk about your experiences. The topic of discussion is duality, self and society. Tell me about a challenging situation and what you experienced making the decision for yourself in relationship to others. What kind of things did you have to consider? What kind of feelings did you go through in taking on that role of specific others?
I have kind of a unique issue where I have chemical sensitivity, so scents shut my throat very quickly. Even things like certain deodorants or certain detergents or any kind of thing. So I asked my students to kind of, try not to wear anything scented so that I don't, have to deal with my throat closing. And of course they don't believe me, and then they always test it. And then it'll close in class, and then they freak out because they think I'm going to die. But at those points, even if I can get my throat to kind of open back up, I have to decide whether I'm going to go back into class, because I don't want to leave them without an instructor. But I also know that if I go back in, that I may not make it out the second time. So I constantly have to really think about this and figure out, what can I do to keep me in the class as much as possible without sacrificing, learning time. And it ends up being kind of a difficult scenario when I have to do it more than, once in a class. And usually that happens 2 to 3 times in an 8-week time period. So it's kind of rough. And sometimes I have to say, you know what, I'm going to have to take a step back, because if I come in, I'm not going to make it out. And you guys are going to have to, do these assignments on your own. And it's kind of a hard thing to decide and to kind of deal with. Usually they try to stop wearing stuff though after that happens. Sometimes, not all the time. But I know that's a weird one, but.
Well, we want our students to be considerate
Yeah.
of others,
Mhm.
in certain situations, and yours is a very unique situation. I'm sure they go from one classroom to the next,
Yes.
forgetting the specific needs that we
Mhm.
have as individual instructors. And it'll take a little persistence on your part to keep reminding them.
Yeah, absolutely.
To understand you from where you're coming from. It's,
Yep.
it's a skill, and I think it's also something we want our students to try to practice more.
Mhm.
Knowing that they're going to be entering certain fields like nursing or social work or care services.
Yeah, exactly. I try to use it as a teachable moment. And what I find is as I go along, some of the students actually champion with that and try to help each other. And I've had students say, "Oh, so and so smelled like something. I sent them out before you walked in." And I'm like, "Okay, I appreciate that."
Yeah.
So they do learn it. They do learn from it, kind of a life lesson. Some do, at least.
So that's a key point that I want to leave off on. What life lessons do we learn from this game? Now, in my classes, I usually have this game played in class, or you can have it online. And I use it for the chapter on stratification and inequality, especially when we're talking about poverty and the difficult decisions that individuals who have less resources have to make. And as I can see, some of you are already posting, there was some issues of ethics and morality, of course, personal health, and not only yours, but yourself. You had to consider the health, for example, of here someone had a pooch. And I think there was a time in the game where you had to decide whether or not a pet needed help, right? And so We are learning ethics and morality, and at the same time, we're learning to be aging parents. I mean, we don't know the kind of decisions that parents have to make or adults have to make unless we're in that situation. And this is a game that allows our students to experience the specific stress that people without resources go through, and enables to get them to empathize with those situations. Thank you for sharing your thoughts here, Kate and Jean, Jessica, and your conversations about this game. It helps us understand each other. That's a very good point that Celia makes, and helps us understand each other. If we return, I want to return back to the PowerPoint, because one of Mead's primary, ultimately the end goal for Mead was to teach our students in order to consider generalized others. So unlike mimicking or playing, gamification teaches students or brings students to the next level of critical thinking. It is where they're going to be working with organizations, and they have to consider a generalized other. And what a generalized other means is they have to anticipate the consequences that their decision is going to make when they are in leadership positions, or when they're making decisions that impact other people. Now, these are more complicated games that probably require more time, but I love using complicated games, for example, in my discussion boards. Instead of a video or an issue or conversation, I have students play the game, a very complicated game, in order to see the process that they go through in realizing themselves. And self-realization comes in relationship to other people. And so they have to anticipate that their decisions are going to have consequences on groups, organizations that they're going to be working in. And so one example of that I have, we're not going to play it, but I am going to share it with you, is a game called, I'm going to teach teachers play, or I'm going to allow students to play, but let's not play it right now. Basically, it's called the fiscal ship. And for my chapter on economy and politics, I want to teach my students about not only being fiscally responsible, but the fact that there is this ideology that we have about social change. And while we embrace social change and we want to make the world a better place, sometimes we teach about making change, but what is missing is the link to the consequences that are based on our own ideologies. How does our ideologies work in real life? That is, our ideologies always suggest that we should do something, a certain kind of policy. But that policy in actual reality may be counterproductive. It may not mesh well with our ideology. And so this new game here involves putting the student as the president or someone who is in a political decision to decide policy based on their ideology, and then determine whether or not they can decrease the national debt. So I'll show this small video just to describe what this game actually does.
Welcome aboard the fiscal ship. You need to captain the USS federal budget to avoid the stormy seas of debt while delivering on governing goals. First, you'll select your governing goals. The goals are your aspirations and values, the ones that shape the kind of country we live in. Pick 3 or 1 or 2 if you want less of a challenge.
So at the very beginning, this is excellent because students have some ideals or ideology about how society should work or function. And these ideals are very progressive sometimes, and we want to make change. And you are allowed to actually test your ideas by selecting what kind of assumptions you have about the better world you want to create. So that's step 1.
Now you'll need to develop a plan. Which tax and spending policies will allow you to meet your governing goals while also bringing down the federal debt? These are collections of policies. Each holds choices that you will use to meet your goals and lower the debt. You can look at each policy and see how it will affect spending or revenue, and see arguments for and against. You also get a preview of how this policy will affect the projected level of federal debt. The white line shows how the policies you have already chosen affect the debt. The orange line shows how the policy you are considering will alter the debt. If you choose to add this to your plan, you will see if it affects your governing goals and whether it helps you earn stars. You can review the policies you've already chosen by selecting My Plan. Here you get an overview of how your choices have affected spending and revenue. You can see how they've affected your governing goals, and if you want, you can remove policies from your plan. When you meet your governing goals and the target debt level, you win. Now you can review your plan, and more importantly, share it with other people and show them how you would solve the federal debt.
Ooh, so as you can see, this game is a bit more complicated than adorable, and it's a bit more complicated than the previous game that we played. This game actually can be something used throughout the entire semester as students learn new information and change the policies which are not working. I have to tell you, I'm not very good at it. When I chose some policies based on my ideologies, the line skyrocketed and the national debt went up, And so I thought, well, maybe I should tweak not only the policy, but the way I think about the world that I want to create. And it's a very engaging, ongoing process of realizing that our ideologies, in fact, have consequences for other people. It's a great game to show, but it does require a great deal more time. You can just type the fiscal ship on Google and it'll give you access to it. So what does this all mean when it comes to structuring our class? Well, here's what I wanted to show you, that the things that I'm planning and what I'm going through today as I prepare and began doing this activity. I want to share. A very important part of gamification is actually scaffolding. And you want to start the semester, how do I gamify is one of the questions. Start the semester, I think, with very easy beginning games for them to be able to understand and remember the content, especially introduction to sociology classes, I believe start at the lower level of thinking in Bloom's taxonomy. For the first 5 weeks, I think the students can learn the rules of behavior, the concepts and assumptions behind the ideas in our textbooks. And eventually, as the semester progresses, we can play more complicated games. For example, in stage 2, in playing a game, I'm becoming a sociologist, we will take on particular roles in decision making. So they have to analyze and they have to apply the information that they're learning. After the 10 weeks, ideally, I want students to engage in more complicated decision making. They actually become sociologists where they are creating and evaluating solutions to problems that we have. Now, there are games at different levels, and each of us has to sort of gauge at the game and the objective that we want to achieve. And so I have some good ideas for you on how to gamify. First, gamification, people see it as something that they have to become tech savvy or game developers. There are many online games that are free to use without membership. There are some apps that require you to become a member, but the games that I showed you today are absolutely free and they cost nothing to students, and they're free to the public. And so resources as a faculty is something that we don't have to worry about when we find games that are already online that we don't have to develop, but that we can quickly use in our classes to reach our student learning outcome. Second, they are low risk. I used to do activities with my students with paper and pencil or groups conversations, but COVID has really changed the way we teach in our environment. And games that we get are really useful because they are low risk and very little liability without the interaction. We can actually play the games in the traditional classroom using our computers and then talking about the conversations or having conversations as a class. Due to the fact that we have to social distance, that made teaching very difficult when we had group activities. So games allows us then to gamify our classroom and use computers and use games that are free in real life while we're teaching. We could also individualize learning. And by individualized learning, I mean that we can select the level of difficulty for our students. I really didn't think about this, but I used to have students apply the material within the first 2 weeks, like they were learning complicated theories, Marx, Durkheim, Mead, Weber. And here I was asking my students within the first 2 weeks of class to apply it to real life. And it was not a pretty outcome. It was not a pretty result. I had to, think that my students can't apply the material right away. And so they require what's called adaptive learning or scaffolding. Individualize the game or to put the game to the individual at the level that they are ready to participate. Games also are not just for fun. Okay, most of the games that we use, we have to select them based on the outcome of having a better learning experience. What is that game going to teach my students? Can I even use it for this lesson? How much of the game actually is relevant to the lesson that I'm teaching? There are some games that we might think are cute and fun, but we play them just for fun or passive learning. It won't retain our students' attention. It won't engage them. And so deep thought and reflective games happen when students are engrossed in a game that has to do with the activity at hand that you're doing for that session. Positive change. Everybody wants positive change. And one of the things that I like to teach in my class is that we can make positive change, but at the same time, we have to be conscientious of both the manifest and latent consequences, the explicit and implicit results of our actions, and have to be accountable for that. And so the more complicated the game gets, the more students become aware that their choices or their ideologies have real impact on other people, and they're able to envision that. So in the end, gamification can be put in place. Currently, I only have these 3 games for the semester. And maybe next semester, I'll add a different one. And so that covers 4 chapters. And every semester, I'm out looking for new games that are free online. But a game is not complete without rewards. And because you held on to me and you were so patient listening to this presentation, I'm going to give you a freebie. Here is a free reward for you to find a game to try in your classrooms this semester based on your discipline. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to Nearpod and tap on explorable explanations. This is your reward for listening to me, for going through the games, for participating, and for being part of this session. We can click on Explorables. This is where the game Adorable came from. But I have also used several games based on my discipline. We have chemistry, journalism, economics, psychology, social sciences. Particularly, for example, in social sciences, you have very cute games here to start off with. I show my students, for example, in the chapter of crowds about social networking. And so I just click on the game and I'm ready to play in class. The madness of crowds. And so you click on play and students begin their gamification. And so choose a game, explore the games, go find something that you like, and attach it. Make sure the game is attached to a certain learning outcome that you want. And also it gives you some opportunity for open discussions in the classroom. So this is your free reward that you can actually adapt a game. And if you want, let me know how that went, and how you're trying to gamify your classrooms at your college. So thank you very much for joining me today. I think we're running out of time, and I do appreciate you sharing your experiences. Any comments? I have to read the comment section, or any last ideas by people are certainly welcomed.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Good afternoon, Chuck. Thank you, Celia. I appreciate that comment.